All right, let me see. Confirm some things. Make sure I've got this going. Jack, can you give me a level just real quick, just so I make sure I have the right audio sort of working as I want.
This is Jack Hart. It's pleasant to be here. I notice your book on Wu Wei Wu sounds a lot like the Borat line, wah wah wee wah.
Wei Wu Wei, it means action through inaction. It's the name he took after becoming a pretty significant scholar in this space.
As opposed to the fourth greatest journalist in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, the third. Well, now fourth, I suppose. Yeah, now he's the fourth. I guess you're a fan of the Borat extended universe.
Well, I was gonna say now he's the third because his daughter killed Johnny the monkey. So.
All right, you guys talk for 2 seconds. I'm gonna I gotta grab something real quick, and then we'll get going. We'll give everyone a second to join.
In a strange way, Borat actually is appropriate for a certain discussion on humor and irony, right?
I mean, equally, I'd maybe only be being 50% ironic when I'd suggest that Borat is a pretty good example of Wu Wei himself.
I endorse that comment.
That might be everyone. That's okay. This is a whole section here. We're going to end up having a lot of discussion, I think, around a handful of elements here. It's going to be a whole thing. But I think maybe I'll just kick it off, as I always do. Hello, and thank you, and welcome to the Deleuze and Guattari's Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we're moving into Series 19, that of the humor of humor. There's a lot that goes on inside of this section. It's going to be quite a bit to get into, especially once we start having the discussion I think that JC and I ended up with last night, which is the difference between humor and irony, and digging into that, which is its own entire thing. But before we dive in, is there any major announcements, anything going on that we want to have as that discussion in the background there?
Yeah, we should mention that for the Devigations Conference, because we're always trying to promote that, right? We will be issuing a more formal call for papers very shortly. I anticipate sometime next week, so keep an eye out for that, because that will be your cue to start writing, yeah? So that's everything for me, at least.
Fair enough. Anything, Lou, Lou and Triad, we got your announcements out today. We got more stuff happening. Bergson this week is discussing Deleuze, which should be very fun. I hope to be able to join that myself. And I know Continental Philosophy Server's got a whole bunch going on, Triad. So we've got that this week. Any other major stuff, or we'll just kick in, because this is I think we'll just kick in. So, man, where to even fucking start with this one? So we start by opening up really with this idea of Platonic language and ideas, and this idea of the pre-Socratic physical language, the way that one says and one talks, I think is probably the easiest place for us to sort of start. The opening line here, the opening paragraph, ends with a line that I think JC and I both agreed is phenomenal, and kind of the point of the opening of the section. It's, as Chrysippus says, if you say chariot, a chariot passes through your lips. It is neither better nor more convenient if this is the idea of a chariot. This idea that Platonic language and pre-Socratic language deal with idealistic or purely physical, manic and schizophrenic, and sort of the separation between the two. the foundation between them starts to sort of crumble as we talk through them. This leads into a larger discussion around this concept of the idealist sort of conception of language, as we've sort of been talking about. We just got out of the three kinds of philosophers, from the heights with Plato to the depths of the pre-Socratics or Nietzsche, to end on that of the surface, or that of the Stoics, or ultimately, I think, Deleuze and Guattari, and those sort of in their milieu. Does anyone want to jump in and talk about their versions of this sort of opening and what they got from it? Because there's a lot before we get into Zen and Stoicism and that of the surface.
Yeah, I think this series is in two main parts. The first part is trying to answer the question, what makes language possible? And the second part is about who speaks. So this first part, this first paragraph, goes through the impossibility of the Platonic language, in which, because it says, because the reason for that is by what miracle propositions would participate in the ideas. So you could say, in Platonic understanding, language is based upon the ideas, but Deleuze asks the question, by what miracle do propositions participate in the ideas? So this notion of participation is central to how ideas work. And then the second, then he says bodies. Can bodies ground language? And he says when sounds fall back and bodies become the passion mixed bodies, they're no more than the bearers of agonizing nonsense. So he kind of is dismissing both understandings of what makes language possible, i.e. the Platonic speech based upon language, based upon the ideas, and what you might call Socratic, based upon the, as you said, the body. And he said there's only one alternative, and that is, he said it's the alternative imposed with no way out. Either you can just say nothing, or to incorporate what one says. And this word incorporate is quite important because it means to bring into the body what one says, that is to eat one's words. So this notion again of this kind of the taking in of words. And he said that is to eat on words. And then he gives this example of words and the being within the body. So if you say, so Chrysippus says, if you say chariot, a chariot passes through your lips. And it's no better, it doesn't matter, it can be a real chariot or it can be the idea of a chariot, it doesn't matter either.
It is neither better nor more convenient. That phrasing, I think, is spot on with what you're talking about. And it's the contrasting of the two. On the one side, he's basically saying, we talk about things. When we talk about things, when we talk about things, ultimately we're reliant on the bodies. And then the question is, the other direction, if we start talking about bodies, ultimately we, as you said, we dive directly into nonsense, because since we're no longer within signification, we can't really make sense of how things are connected, and things sort of jumble, the schizophrenic sort of aspect to the entire thing. The two sides of it ultimately with that final line is just solid.
Yeah, and then in paragraph 2, he seems to be acting like a Stoic, effectively. So and it's a Stoic directed against Platonic language, so, or as he calls it, the idealist language, in which he says made up of hyperdatized significations. So things are kind of, the sort of ideas are treated as real. On this question, then the second line, which says, every time we will ask about signifiers such as what is beauty, justice, man, is the classic question that's asked within the Socratic dialogues. So these dialogues usually start with Socrates asking the question that's formulated in the form of what is. And so the question is, what is beauty, what is justice, what is man? And what these questions are asking about are the essence of something. What is the essence of something, which obviously relates to the idea. And he says we will respond to it by designating a body. So the wrong way in which to answer the question, what is example, beauty or justice or man, is to designate a body. That's the wrong way to do it, because what you're pointing to is a real thing rather than the idea of something. But he's I think acting in a stoic way against the Platonic kind of against Platonic thinking.
Yeah, and he even brings up the example of Plato saying that, well, man is what is man? Man is a biped and featherless animal, and Diogenes brought a chicken that had been plucked and said, well, they're cool. This is man then, which is it's intended to be sort of mocking towards the idea, but it's again being so reliant on bodies as this base sort of foundational layer in order to have these definitions means that you're going to necessarily miss the things between the bodies that sort of help them have sense. I'm trying not to use language from this. It's tough. It's tough not to sort of get in that circle of talking about the thing that we're talking about. But that's a lot of that sort of humor that he's talking about here, or the jokes he makes. What is philosophy? And Diogenes again has the example and brings out a cod at the end of a string, sort of as a more as snide response, but it's intended to sort of mock this idea of using bodies to talk about these ideas. And conversely, he talks about sort of the reverse, where I think it's towards the end of this paragraph. Let's see, where is that? Hurls it is in the next paragraph. Where does the descent hurl us? It hurls us to the ground of bodies, the groundlessness of the mixture, where every denotation is prolonged in consumption, pulverization, and destruction, without there being any chance of arresting this movement, as if the staff shattered everything. Because of this, its clear language can be no more based on denotation than signification. When signification hurls us into pure denotations, which replace and negate them, we are faced with the absurd as that which is without signification, and vice versa. So it's this, either one is not necessarily its own foundation and relies on the other in a way that sort of breaks apart. And his response, and I like this. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we should be on it. I think the second paragraph is quite important though, because he's combating the Platonic directly with the kind of instances of humor and irony. So for example, so the question. So if you answer a question posed by Socrates that's posed in the form of what is, when you give an example, then you're looked down upon. You're seen to have taken the wrong direction. That's not what the question. The question "what is asked about is a definitional question. That's about the definition of, for example, beauty or justice. So what does the definition do? It gives the essence of something. So if you then point to a body and say, look, it's what is beauty of that person is beautiful, therefore that is beauty, then you'll be looked down upon. But I think these examples, Diogenes, and the example of the plucked fowl is a featherless biped, is one of humor and perhaps irony as well. So it's kind of combating the Platonic with these responses. But also Plato himself laughed at those who are satisfied with giving examples. So there's kind of there's humor employed perhaps on both sides. So it's not just located within the Stoics. Plato laughed at those who are satisfied giving examples rather than attaining the essences.
Yeah, and I think it's important to. Sorry, go ahead, Trad.
I just wanted to mention, because maybe I just understood you wrong, but it sounds like that Plato was mocking these and not laughing maybe with them, because he was mocking these who just told some examples or showed stuff because they wouldn't get to the essence of stuff. At least in my German translation, there's another term for that that's very negatively connotated, and not laughing with them, or
it's laughing at
approaching
specifically.
No, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and to the aspect of irony, I guess humor is here something something against the irony, because at the end of the second paragraph, it's said that it's against this Socratic irony, or the technique of
Assent.
assent. Yes, right. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and I think the specific examples that are given, a way to break them down, and I think this is important as we talk about humor or irony, because we're going to have this debate, don't worry. But the specific uses where Plato is asking, what is idea X? And he's asking, what is representation X? Beauty, justice, man. What is man? And to answer, he says, Plato, it is biped and featherless. And those are bodies. A biped is essentially a body. Featherless is a body. They're both ideas of bodies, but they're bodies. And Diogenes the Cynic comes at him and shows him a thing that is those bodies as well as not the idea. And there's a thing that's happening there that I think is very important, that when we start getting into Deleuze's reference of what humor is, or how humor plays versus irony, and how these sort of different elements play, it's, to me, important to think of the strata of each of the different elements that compose these. When we have the what is philosophy? Like, if there is a more grand question in the idea space higher up, I'd be surprised to find it. But then again, there's the responses with a fish, which is meant to be like a play on, again, the way that bodies, the depths, plays with the heights. And somehow this fish is somehow neither, because it plays in a different spot. I think it's important to talk about the strata, the sort of three strata, as we get through this, because each of the examples is going to be really unique. To start breaking this down, I may have gone overboard breaking these down last night and rereading this like 30 times. But the specific sort of way that he's going through this is that it's the Plato, I want to have an idea. What is this? Please, can we only discuss ideas when I ask what an idea is? I don't want to talk about bodies. I want to reference them, but I want to stay in ideas. And then someone comes and shows him a thing, and he laughs at that because that's beneath him. Like, there is definitely a derision with how Plato treated such responses, and like it was almost childish, the way that they did it. And that, I think, is going to be really important as we move to the next few paragraphs as sort of the next version of that, or what an alternative would be towards, answering only with bodies or only with ideas.
Yeah, at the end of the second paragraph, he says what is required is humor as opposed to Socratic irony, or the technique of the assent. So I think there is irony and humor are, I would say, definitely different from each other. And there is this, within the dialectic, there is this use of irony. So it's kind of misleading. It's saying something, what is said. I think that's why I would understand irony. And I think that's part of the Socratic method, I would say, is that because basically the relationship between the Socrates and the interlocutor, Socrates and whoever is speaking, who he's speaking with, and there is a kind of constant misleading, a constant pointing in a wrong direction, which the interlocutor will take and then will be seen to be false before being led back to the right direction, I think that's, for me, how I would understand irony. Whereas I think before, they were more examples of humor, I would say. So if someone says the definition of man is of a featherless biped, and then someone says, gets a chicken, plucks it, and said, here you are, here's a man, this is a man. I think that's that's what happened there. Or someone says, what is philosophy? And they bring 100%. A fish.
100%. I have to go with Claire Colebrook wrote a wonderful book called Irony. That's really worth diving into, especially after reading this, because there's an entire chapter dedicated to humor and Deleuze and Guattari specifically, and it's a great deal of it. But the way she defines it out, and she goes through the history of irony, kind of from all the different layers to the romantic irony. We'll get into all these versions of irony in just a moment, but ultimately she lands on humor as being a different point of it. Humor is something, it is not the reversal of cause and effect, to quote, but the abandonment of the before and after relations, the line of time that allows us to think in terms of causes, intentions, grounds, and consequence. She uses the example of, to quote, if Samuel Beckett's theater is absurd, it is not because life is rendered despairingly meaningless. Rather, we laugh when the order of time and explanation no longer holds. Consider a typically contradictory exchange from Endgame. Quote, what time is it? The same as usual. The humor of Endgame lies in its confusion of logic and the order of sense. Concepts are used, not just in ways that suggest an unconventional meaning, which would be irony, but in ways that destroy the very convention of meaning itself. One cannot mean or say anything without some shared order of a before and after, a sense of what is and is not. She's going off of a lot of Deleuze and Guattari's following writings to get to that, but it's a very subtle difference that she's going after, and very subtle one, I think, that Deleuze is outlining here for us and will continue to be as we continue through this. But it's a really interesting, again, lens to think of where this meaning is generated, where the sense is generating, that allows us to have irony or humor or the responses we do.
So what Deleuze is asking in paragraph 2 is that we descend. So he says that Plato asks us to, Plato asks us to ascend, so towards the ideas, and he says at it says halfway through, bottom of page 139 in my copy. He said we can ask Plato to follow. Easy to ask Plato to follow down the path which he claimed to make us climb. So he wants to descend, which would make sense, obviously. But he said in the next part, where does such a descent throw it? It hurls into the ground of bodies and groundlessness of their mixtures.
I think it would be worth continuing to move on as we make our way through this, because it continues to be, as we start playing this idea, as we move from the world of significations, and when significations hurl us into pure denotations, which replace and negate them, we're faced with an absurd which is without signification. We're now in that place, he calls it the subsense or Untersinn, the nonsense of it. Is there a way out? By the same movement with which language falls from the heights and then plunges below, we're led back to the surface, where there is no longer anything to denote or signify, but where pure sense is produced. It is produced in its essential relation to the third element. And this is where I think this is where this starts getting fun. But please, I'll let someone else speak.
Yeah, so I think these notions of denotation and signification. So denotation is that through which the bodies, the states of affairs are designated or indicated, and the signification is that through which concepts are spoken. And so obviously both the signification would have a relationship to the idealism, whereas the denotation has this in Deleuze's analysis to the pre-Socratic's underground bodily engagement. So they say neither of these, because remember what is he looking for in this section? He's looking for the foundation of language. So what as he said a bit later on, what makes language possible? And he said it's neither denotation nor signification. It's not in denoting the bodies or signifying the concepts. It's neither of those two things.
Yep. Any other thoughts on this before we continue on?
He says we must return to the surface.
Any
where we
thoughts?
find sense which has neither body or concepts. I'm just saying he's saying we must return to the surface where we find sense which is neither bodily nor conceptual.
Yeah, I mean, fuck it. Let's just move on. It's where we encounter pure sense, pure events. This where sense itself is generated. If we go back to the static Genesis, that we just went through, the static logical genesis, everything that we've just been sort of digging up, the surface is this place where the immanent meaning of a thing is almost apperceived. There's this moment of where the sense is generated, where the pure event is, and that's the surface. Then this is where he wants us to return to, this place of pure singularities, where they have and are considered from their aleatory element, independent of individuals or persons which embody them or actualize them. It doesn't even matter who actualizes or that. It's this element that is sort of generated in that moment. And there's a thing that he keeps talking about that I think is worth keeping in mind, or at least it was for me. One of the things he keeps saying we have to do, and he's said it a few times and he will continue to, is that when someone comes to us asking for an example of a thing and they want to have sort of that heady assent conversation, the Platonic, the faster we can give them an example, the faster we can show them that featherless bird or the fish on a string, the sooner we can do that, the better, because there's a speed to it and I think that driving for him towards that speed is important. He keeps bringing it up, and one of the reasons for that is because we are now playing at that sort of plane of eminence. But so if we go to the surface, and now we're sitting there, and this is where sense is. What does this look like? How is this experienced? And what is sort of the way that we take this in? And he goes right to this adventure of humor, and he starts bringing up Zen and the difference between, in sort of Eastern texts, the difference between the Brahman depths and the Buddhist heights, which is a really interesting, I thought, a really interesting move, because it's spot on as far as like Eastern thought goes, in the same sort of way of the depths of the totality of substance, which is the Brahman, and then the Buddhist heights, which is very much the place of ideas or concepts and a sense. But with Zen being kind of that space in the middle, this idea of almost sense itself that is experienced through as he has the question answers, the koans, that demonstrate the absurdity of significations, and so the nonsense of denotations in and of themselves. We had a whole bunch last night that we talked through, but the way that koans operate, the one that he uses here, if you have a cane, I am going to give you one. If you do not have one, I take it away. It's a wonderful line, but the Zen masters are 100% about finding this place where we're no longer in signification and where we don't rely on denotation. And the staff being that element, if there is a speedy, instantaneous thing that you deal with when a person moves towards, and it is pretty consistent throughout scriptures of Taoist scriptures, Zen scriptures, Buddhist even, the idea of the student who asks a question that is, I need an example of a thing, or what is this? And it's all playing in that place of assent. They get a strike with a staff, because it's this intense, immediate response. It's intended to help pull the student away from that vein of thinking. I think this is a wonderful section. But I'll let someone else speak. I was hoping Ben would be able to join us because he runs our Dao Lu Zen group, and that would be fantastic. But sadly, no, he hasn't been here.
I wanted to ask a question. Is this related to the fifth series where he talks about the four paradoxes, and or the paradoxes? This kind of paradox between the heights and the depths that you ran into in irony.
Yes, I mean, so this comes through sort of his running thing through a lot of this is the topology of how propositions operate and the parts of them. Proposition by nature is going to have signification, denotation, manifestation. Signification is the sort of meaning and concepts, and they tend to come in form of a chain based on the context we're discussing them in. Denotation is essentially, I'm pointing at a body with this word. I say lipstick. Am I invoking the correct word? Am I denoting it properly? Is the thing that matters there. With manifestation being the last, which is generally speaking, who is saying it, and the fact that I'm sort of inserted in everything I say, the manifestation being sort of that third part. These three elements are what make up propositions, the problem being that where they ground their meaning either comes from, as he talks about it, the ascents, the heights, the ideas, the ideals, which is very Platonic, or the bodies, the mixtures of things, the actual things as they are in states of affairs. And we have those two levels. And as he's gone through all of these series, and the fourth series of dualities for sure is about it, I think he's a lot more clear as he starts getting into, I want to say, I mean, even the 18th series we just went through of the philosophers, but I think 13th is the schizophrenic and the little girl, where he goes through bodies and surfaces, how they play, and how the schizophrenic sort of fails to be at the surface, and how he operates versus the little girl sort of against that, and how they play with nonsense in a different spot. So that's the difference between, say, surface and the depths. But he goes through a lot of it. But again, I think 18th series is where he very much points out, like, we have three types of thinking, three types of activities, three types of relations, three types of diseases, and they are of the heights, the depths, and the surface. The heights, again, being the Platonic, the depths, the pre-Socratic, the pure bodies, and the surface being that of the Stoics, or his interpretation of Stoics, almost a neo-Stoicism, which, it's gross as I said it out loud. I hate neo anything, but like, this plays into a different place because of that. So that's kind of, it's been a thread through the whole thing. I hope that answers your question, JK.
Yeah, pretty closely. Yeah. So the kind of like nonsense that occurs, with the with the definition of a human, and then the guy brings in a featherless bird, featherless biped. So it's kind of like these paradoxes that was talked about in the fifth series. Is this kind of a nonsense that occurs, right, when you try to affirm that the ground of propositions,
Yeah, it's playing with the idea of how we understand things in an incorporeal way. With Plato, we understand things in an ideational way. There's ideals that sort of make things out. The pre-Socratics are like the Nietzschean kind of way of thinking, is that bodies, the like hard materials, is all there is, and there's no. It's in between. We have this like incorporeal level. We were discussing different versions of this in pop culture last night, and I have to go with, I think my favorite example is gonna be Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. If I were to ask you, what is God, or what is Christ, if I were to ask that to anyone, I could do it in a couple different ways. I ask straight out, what is Christ? We may have a Platonic type conversation where someone says, oh, it's the Savior, blah, 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 blah. And they may give a big, long story. Someone of the depths may, be a little bit more, what I might call cynical, like really just it's just a dude who lived, blah, blah. There's more to it. There's something sort of incorporeal. So in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, they get to the very end where they have to choose amongst all of the grails. There's a whole bunch of chalices. Which one is the one Christ had? And in this moment, they're essentially asking, what is God? Who is God? Describe God. And one of the guys, the Nazi, picks this ridiculously gaudy, the most beautiful, overdone, jewel-encrusted thing. And he drinks up, he dies, he melts, it's great. Indy picks up this wooden, humble chalice, probably the one that looks the most humble of all of them. If I were to say, that's Christ, or use that as my example instead of showing a plucked bird, for example, but I hold that chalice up, there is an immediate understanding, an incorporeal sense that is generated of what I'm trying to say and the example I'm giving in that moment. It's not a idea that I'm talking about. I'm not giving any specific bodies. I'm not saying he's literally the cup. obvious. I hope you don't think that. But there's something incorporeal that's generated now in that moment, that this sense that exists between bodies and ideas that sort of are incarnated inside of that moment. And when you see that, and it's like, oh, yes, I get what you fucking mean. I get what you mean by that. I hold up this example, this thing, and it's instantaneously understood. It's the famous old westerns where a guy says to the 9-year-old, "Oh, Tom, you said you always wanted to know what bravery was," and he hands him a gun. It's not that the gun is literally bravery. It's not that he's having an idealized discussion. He's giving him the example of the thing. There's a powerful moment in the way that these things operate, and we'll get into a little bit more in that. But this is this very interesting way of splitting the difference. And the best way to understand it, really, and we should move on because we're going to start talking through, I want to come back to the Zen stuff and all of this, but I think it's worth having a discussion on what is irony and how is the individual generated, because that's really what the next few chapters are about. Does anyone want to comment on this paragraph before we move on? Because I think getting through the who speaks section is going to be super important. Sorry for the long ramble.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to say that in that paragraph, I think it's quite important that he kind of says what this sense is. So there's a passage beginning, return to the surface, the sage discovers object event. So this is what is discovered at the surface. So the question at the beginning of this paragraph is, what does the wise man find at the surface? Find at the surface. So later on it says, return to the surface, sage discovers object events, all of them communicated in the void, which constitutes their substance. So the substance is the void. Their substance is the void. That's one thing to think about. He discovers that he discovers the eon in which they are sketched out and developed without ever filling it up. And then the next sentence is important. The event is the identity of form and void. So he kind of gives a definition here, even though he's sort of antagonistic towards definitions. The event is the identity of form and void. They kind of mirror each other, the form and the void. So it's not the object as denoted. So it's not the object as denoted. So if you read a kind of sentence such as the one that the Zen one that is given, the object there is not the object denoted, but the object as expressed or expressible. It's never present, but always ready in the past and yet to come. So when we read it, we kind of read it as a real thing, as a thing having a body, being denoted as a real thing. But then no, it's expressed. It has this sense. It's in this sort of void. And in that way, he's trying to get us to read this thing from the Zen master in that sense. So he says later on, the negation never longer expresses anything negative, but rather releases the pure expressible within two even halves. So it's releasing the expressible. That's what's happening. It's not saying the cane is, in the sense of denotation would make the cane appear as what it is, as a cane. There would be a state of affairs fulfilled in the denotation. Basically, corresponds to affairs. It says what something is. But it says no, this is not it as it is. It's a kind of the identity of the form and void.
Well, that sounds like a paradox, saying it's a void and also a form at the same time. It's kind of paradoxical. Yeah.
It depends what you mean by form there, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, because for Plato, form is something real, something, as you can.
No, it's not. No.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is something that is originary and constitutive, right? So you can say, yeah, but in this context, it is like a colon. It is one and is both and neither at the same time.
Yeah, I think if you read that literally, if you have a cane, I'm giving you one. If you don't have one, I'm taking it away. If you read that in a kind of literal sense, you can't make any sense of it. It doesn't make sense, But the sense is released. I think what Deleuze saying, it's released in its expression. It's what's expressible within what's being said. Right, so the void is itself the paradoxic element, the surface nonsense. That's a bit
Mm.
later on.
And it's quite interesting because, and maybe I hope this doesn't go too far when he's talking about the void here in the paragraph and of the drawing without drawing, the not thinking, the shooting, which becomes a non-shoot, so to speak. I'm just translating on the fly from my edition here. Sorry, but it really much reminds me of Derrida here again, and it's almost at the same time Deleuze is writing this here, and it's something Derrida does as well when he's talking about something like the Hythen or of these places of the in between of the Fatiche, the Zwischen or Dazwischen in German, and of difference, of this unground that is making possible sense out of something that isn't inherently senseful. So it's this moment of an oscillation between something that is virtual and almost actualized, but it is this moment, this event that is the aim here. This aspect that is that cannot be pinned down because we always come too late in our description of it. It's always just a trace and something we can never reach because it is this thing that has almost just the function of an appel, of something that is just calling from the past, so to speak, and we can only understand retrospectively, but then it's already gone. But we need this interval, this distance, to even establish some sort of sense and meaning. But by that, the pure aspect of or the imminence of the event is already gone, and that's this constant oscillation or fluctuation, this ambiguity that is at the bottom of every form of consistency uh, that births this, so to speak, like the chora in Plato, this in between space that it has all these connotations, at least after Kristeva, of the female womb, something that is forming something out of the chaos, or bringing it to some sort of coherence, but still is not something very rigid and um, um, a pure form or idealistic in this sense.
Yeah, and I think that last bit of that paragraph is kind of sums what you're saying, Trad. So he says to paint without painting. So we paint, but we paint without the understanding of painting. I think non-thought, shooting without, which becomes non-shooting, to speak without speaking. This is not all the ineffable up above. So it's not the idealistic heavens or the bodily down below, but rather the frontier. And again, he's talking about the frontier and the surface where language, this is what makes language possible. This is, and he's answering his question us at the beginning of this series. He said, this is what makes language becomes possible. And by becoming possible, inspires only a silent and immediate communication. So it's silent. Either we can, as you said, you can either remain silent or you can eat your words. And so this is that example. Since it could only spoke in the resuscitation of all immediate and abolished significations or denotations.
So this idea of form and void, it sounds like the collapsing of the Platonic, idea of being and becoming, together. And for him, that's the virtue. He doesn't use virtue anymore, but he uses the ion, right, as a kind of experience of the time that goes in two directions, but it's never present.
Well, I guess it's not so much Platonic as it is maybe I don't know if this term is correct, but Neo-Platonic or Stoicistic, in the sense of the atomists, because they have this very interesting notion, and that's something I guess it was Eldreams here on the server who mentioned this in one of our Zizek readings, and in Derrida as well. They have this interesting notion of the klinamen, that is this complementary notion or concept in relation to these constitutive atoms. Oh yeah, the Epicureans. Thank you. And the clinamen is more of this void, this empty space that is necessary to even think these. That it's like this foil that brings forth these or makes even possible the distance or the individuality of the singular atoms.
Yeah, it said the inversion of this Platonic idea of a form
Oh yeah,
into
sorry.
the into the realm of just the continuous becoming, the virtual, the ion. Right?
I think what's important in this, at the end of that paragraph, is that he says that language is this immediate and silent communication. And so I think we're always looking for the spoken within language, the thing that's like, going back to Plato, what is the definition of something? And we say, it would give the essence of something. Whereas here he's saying the language, so language becomes possible, and by becoming possible inspires only a silent and immediate communication. And I think that, for me, that gives an idea of what is being communicated, and it's a sense which is not what's being said, Because if you go back to that, is it called a koan, a Zen koan? If you have a cane, I'm giving you one. If you don't have one, I'm taking it away. What is being communicated in that? It's not the fact that the literalness of what's being said. It's the sense, the idea behind what's being said, you could say, or in front of, or beside.
Yeah, just kind of a sense of the nonsense. It comes out of nonsense, and that's that kind of sense is a kind of higher sense, or the sense of the surface. Yeah.
Well, and I think actually at that point it may be good for us to move into, because we've started to edge into the idea of talking about who speaks, because it is thrust of the next few paragraphs as he goes through the discourse of the classical individual, then the romantic discourse, and the person, ultimately talking about sort of the genesis of irony and how irony comes about within this. The opening, if we can just take these one at a time, I think we can get through them fairly quick. The first one he opens up with, when he asks who speaks, we call classic response the one which determines the individual as the speaker. That of which the individual speaks is determined rather as a particularity, and the means, that is, language itself, is determined as a conventional generality. This sort of opening talks through the sort of Platonic concept of the individual, how speaking works, how, again, going back to his ideas of denotation, manifestation, and signification, how meaning and sense is generated, and ultimately irony as he makes his way to that. Does anyone want to expand on sort of my quick summary there? Did I get something wrong?
I just think we need to recognize, he says it's the individual. Remember, we've already spoke about this notion of the individual and the subject, and the difference between the individual and the subject, because this will play a part in this section of this series. So we call classic the response, which determines the individual as a speaker. So here we have the individual speaker. Later on, I will say the speaker will be the subject, and that's a kind of romantic arena.
Right. Well, and it's worth mentioning because you're right. The idea of how the individual sort of comes about, the subject who speaks and remembers is sort of a political subject, and there is a universal form of the individual that comes with this pure idea of what is spoken about, confronting language with an idealized model, and all of this needs to be completed by recovering the individual via this idea. The individual comes about, and this ultimately is this irony that Plato sort of brought about and utilized a great deal. And Platonic irony is a little bit different than what we may sort of commonly use as it, especially because it's really difficult, I think, to make it through translation. From what everyone I've read says, it doesn't quite come through as cleanly. But this is sort of that classical response, is this idea of the individual now exists in a way that is beyond imminent, immediate existence. And this is this universalized form of the individual.
Is that the image of the individual as dramatized in the ancient Greek tragedies?
I think so, yes. Although someone else probably might be able to answer better.
I think the individual, he talks about the individual is in terms of, it's an analytic kind of, the individual is analytic as opposed to the subject which is opposite of analytic, can't remember now. But basically it's descriptive. The individual is, if going from the previous series, I can't remember which series it was, but he talks about the individual. So he differentiates between the individual and the subject. The individual is a way of describing something. So it's like if you take a state of affairs, the individual relation, the relation individual to the state of affairs is one of description, whereas the subject is open to has an extended definition. Yeah. So one is the individual is descriptive, and the subjective is more definitional, I would say. And it does that by bringing in different other predicates to bear upon this, whereas the individual is reliant upon kind of a series of predicates, but not that relate to the individual.
Is that
That's clear.
is that kind of like the individual is based on a universal definition of one who is able to tear away from one's immediate existence and transcend sensible particularities toward the idea? I guess that's the idea is a kind of a universal idea. Right?
I mean, I'm just going along with what Deleuze has previously said about the individual. So he's previously brought this up. I think, I can't remember which series it was. So he kind of distinguished between the individual and the subject. And the irony here is fundamentally one of the individual. And the next one, which is the romantic irony, brings in the person as the individual, the person as the subject. And the kind of ways in which they're defined has been set out previously, I would say. And I'm struggling to remember, but I think that it's fundamentally, you could think of it in terms of propositions, sort of analytic, and my brain is not working, but the other one. Anyway, so one is descriptive, and the other one is definitional, I would say.
I think so. I think I'm following. I'm how I would explain my reading of this, and my understanding is that the individual, as we're talking about now, the Platonic, is this is where it's fun, because we're now talking about things that by even naming them, it sort of defeats the fucking purpose. The subject as such is the experiencer. It is the apparatus that experiences such things. The individual is the moment that experiencer becomes a singular representation. There's no reason for any of us to think that we are necessarily individualized at the pure imminent moment. We're just looking out in the world, experiencing all kinds of stuff. At some point, though, the individual in the Platonic world needs to be formed. The specific phrasing he has is that we have to kind of come back around. There's the subject who speaks and remembers. And how that works is we have this universal form of the individual, which is beyond immediate existence, the Brooks. We'll say Brooks. Brooks says a thing, because I'm a thing that exists beyond just this immediate thing. And I have this pure idea of what is spoken about, which transcends sense, and it confronts language with an ideal model, because it's this idealized version of signification with the laws and the way that sort of language works. All of this is an incomplete circle, has to come back around by recovering the individual as part of it. Manifestation's the problem here. And in Platonic things, this recovery of the individual appears as this irony in the Platonic texts. And the difference between that and, say, a pure subject who may see it doesn't necessarily play with manifestation in the same sense, doesn't have the universalized form of the individual, which exists outside of Chronos. It's the aeon form. Maybe I should just say it that way. Is that fair, Derek? I'm trying to say it that way, that it's Chronos is the subject and aeon is the individual. It's that which exists outside of my immediate experience.
Yeah, I was
I
just
think sorry, go on.
yeah, I think the idea of the use of the word irony is interesting. So is the individual, affirming that I am what I am not, which is not the thing in the particular existence, but something ideal, an idea of what I am? So is that why they call it irony?
I think the individual, in the definition that Deleuze has already given us, is the individual is characterized by analytic predicates, which means they're contained within the individual. So the individual is something that's defined within, from the predicates within the individual, whereas the subject is synthetic, which brings things from the outside to bear upon itself. So these are two kind of, I've just looked it up actually, it's in 16 series. I would personally say that he's bringing in the same definition as previously used for individual and subject. And I think the idea of the subject is something that appears in romanticism. So the individual is prior, it's analytic, it's a descriptive term, whereas the subject is a definitional term.
So that's interesting because okay, so the way irony is used a lot in Plato and before that, and granted, may be completely wrong here. This is after binging way too many books on this recently, and specifically irony. Again, wonderful text. Irony, when it first came about in Aristophanes, right before Plato, and then during Plato's time, like the plays of Aristophanes, irony was just lying. Like that's what it was. Is irony is just lying, and then it sort of morphed into this cute double lie where I'm lying, I'm using words other than what I'm not denoting correctly, I'm not signifying correctly, I'm doing those things intentionally, but I'm doing it in a see, like you know what I mean. And irony came to be this way where it's not just lying, it's lying with you being aware of me as an individual, being aware of what we're both trying to say, but then utilizing idealized language that points in a different direction. That's like Platonic irony is slightly different than ours, but that's kind of where that comes from. So to me, that kind of thing necessitates knowing what I mean when I said things. And that means also that you have to know what Brooks means and who Brooks is, and my full manifestation, and almost like have a representation of me that you insert into such a sentence.
Yeah, I think the use of irony in the Socratic dialogues, I mean, I think an example, my understanding of irony is that it's a deliberately used ploy by Socrates in which the interlocutor is misdirected. So obviously in a dialectical exchange, there's question and answer. So usually Socrates asks a question, the interlocutor answers, and they kind of go on. And Socrates might point something out, say, no, you're wrong, And but there's also a use where Socrates will say something deliberately false and direct the exchange in a direction until they reach aporia, where they can't go, beyond which they cannot go. So I think there's a definite use of irony, but it's within the context of the dialectic. So it's in the context of that exchange between the two interlocutors they're speaking, and it's obviously delivered usually by Socrates. I mean, there are examples of so-called Socratic dialogues in which Socrates doesn't really feature very much, but equally within those there is examples of irony. being used.
Right, but
Right.
more what I'm saying is that, like, the definition, like the difference between irony and humor, and the important thing here is that irony necessitates that I know who said it and that they have a representational quality within my understanding of the world. I know Derek says something, and if I don't know who Derek is, or I just read a thing, I don't know if a thing is irony or if it's lying or if you're just stupid. But if I know, oh, Derek, oh, he's clever Derek. I see what you're saying there. It's irony. Like that inserts the subject as an individual into the thing. And that is the nature of sort of the idealized state of the universalized individual that Deleuze is talking about here.
Yeah, well, like
Well, yeah, I think
Socrates is
in the context of
Socrates is a wise
Go on.
man because he knows that he doesn't know anything.
Well, and he could be full of shit. Derek, go ahead.
I think what just I mean I think the answer is contained in that paragraph. Whether we can extract it is another question. But
well, this is where we last night, me and JC, this is where we ended, is like the fight over the definition of like irony and humor. So we'll get there, I'm sure, again today. But please go ahead.
So I mean, he says it's this conception. So he describes the. I think what he does, he talks about I think he's describing a Platonic understanding about the person who speaks and why they're speaking at the beginning of this paragraph. So a matter of disentangling from a combined threefold operation, a universal form in the individual, which he then in brackets says reality, and at the same time extracting a pure idea, and then confronting language and ideal model assumed to be primitive, natural, purely rational. And he said this is a concept. So this conception of who speaks, speaking, because this is about who speaks, it precisely animates Socratic irony. So this is what animates Socratic irony, and crucially, as an ascent. I think that's a crucial bit, is that it's always aimed towards the ascent, towards the ideas. This is why this is this form of irony aiming towards the ascent. And it gives at once the following task. So to tear the individual away from his or her immediate existence, to transcend sensible particularity towards the idea. So the individual must be torn away from their immediate, from perhaps what their commonly held beliefs are, to transcend sensible particularity. So what they understand as being before them, and to transcend that. So they're going beyond the given, the kind of sense, what's given to their senses, and to establish laws that correspond to the model. So this idea of the model is a kind of ideal thing towards which the thing that participates in the idea goes towards, is trying to imitate. And this is a description of the dialectic. So it is, like I said, it is important that it's a dialectical kind of model in which there is a spoken, there is a back and forth taking place. It's dialectical.
Well, but it has to end with the individual as well, sort of being carried with them. Like if we think of it as I make my ironic statement, it starts from the individual, it starts moving upwards and ascending into the space of ideas. It necessarily, as he talks, the operation with the universality of the idea being like a means of exchange between the two. The whole thing ends with the individual being brought into that space as well. It's almost like it drags the individual as the idea and the irony moves up. It continues to pull the individual away from the surface, from the bodies, from the immediate existence. And that closure he talks about throughout this perfect state, when it finally determines not only the whole reality, but also the whole of the possible as a supreme originary individuality. The nature of irony necessitates that there is almost a God-level knowledge or Platonic understanding of everything, that there is the true form. Irony doesn't work if it's just lies, I guess I would say, because irony is just lies, but it's clever lies that point us things that ideas are slightly different. Haha. And that sort of twist on it that puts things into the place of ideas, into the ascent, necessitates that the individual come with and then be moved out of really immediate experience along with it. maybe I'm speaking wrong on it. This is my understanding as I came out of this, because as he moves on, and I want to, because I do want to get through kind of the next like little bit here. The end of the paragraph, classical irony acts as the instance which assures the coextensiveness of being and of the individual within the world of representation. Thus, not only the universality of the idea, but also the model of a pure, rational language in relation to the first possible ones, become the means of natural communication between a supremely individuated God and the derived individuals which he created. This God renders possible the ascent of the individuals to the universal form. The meaning of things and the ideas of things pull us into them, and the individual sort of sits alongside those as another one of those meanings that sort of is created by the God, which is, just to jump ahead a little bit different than the Kantian critique, which pushes into a different direction and says instead that the individual object is almost itself transcendental. That the person who speaks has the coextensiveness of I and representation, and they then become, this person becomes an unlimited class with one member, which is this romantic irony that Kierkegaard speaks of, which is a hell of a quote, and a very specific pointed moment of the transition between this sort of universalized individual to specifically everyone being an individual who is almost universalized in their class or, you know, their representation, all the way through to the third, which we won't get to. So I kind of do want to move into the romantic. Sorry again for the ramble. I really spent too much time on this fucking last night, like way too much time.
I mean, just sorry to go back to classical irony, but he says at the end of that previous paragraph, classical irony acts as the instance which assures the coextensiveness of being and of the individual within the world of representation. So I think this notion of instance is a thing that kind of that moves between these things. So, and it assures the coextensiveness of being and of the individual within the. So it enables this kind of act of this kind of ascent to take place, I would say, within that sentence. This is why I would read it. It's because I think the idea of instances within up to now are the things that circulate. So he says classical irony acts as the instance which assures. So the irony is assuring being and the individual within the world of representation. And the world of representation is the world of the idea. And this is what this enables. It says so not only the universality of the idea, so the idea is then universally applicable, but there's also a model of a pure rational language. A model is something which you aim towards. It's a kind of model it kind of is a model of something in relation to first possible ones. So, and this is then replicated in the relation, the kind of this theocratic relationship, supremely. So the God is individuated as God, and the derived so, and then we become because we're made in the image of God, we become derived individuals which He creates. This God. So God, again, we could think in terms of the ideas as a kind of standing in for that. This God renders possible the ascent of the individual to the universal form. So the universal form is God, but we're made in that there's an individual God which we are derived from, and which makes so that this relationship between the two is made possible through the individual. Here, this is kind of classic irony.
Just to summarize, there's three figures of irony? The third one comes after Kant?
The third one is, I think, yeah, I mean, it's, I want to say the third is Deleuze's sort of take on this and a pushback towards it, so it's away from irony. Because, no, it's, the romantic is the third. The romantic is the third, and that's kind of what we have today, which is the Kierkegaard quote.
Right.
Sorry, pardon me.
Right. And
So to read a little bit on that one, I'll just read Kierkegaard, who kind of just nails it, and it's a very specific thing. But this infinite poetic freedom, already suggested by the fact that to become nothing at all is itself included, is expressed in a still more positive way, for the ironic individual has most often traversed a multitude of determinations in the form of possibility, poetically lived through them before he ends in nothingness. For irony, as for the Pythagorean doctrine, the soul is constantly on a pilgrimage, except irony does not require such a long time to complete it. The ironist therefore counts on his fingers like a child, rich man, poor man, beggar man, etc. As all these determinations merely have the validity of possibility, he can even run through the whole lot almost as quickly as a child. What costs the ironist time, however, is the care he lavishes on selecting the proper costume for the poetic personage he has poeticized himself to be. When the given actuality loses its validity for the ironist, therefore, this is not because it is outlived actuality, which shall be displaced by a truer, but because the ironist is the eternal ego for whom no actuality is adequate. It's a play towards romantic irony. Derek, do you want to take a crack? JC? I'll leave it open to someone else. JC? Derek?
Sorry. And the only thing at the moment is that at the end of that, he says the ironist is the eternal ego for whom no actuality is adequate. Therefore, it's not what we might say not a real thing. It's not real. So obviously, this has a relationship to sense, which is not real. It's not something actual.
It's yeah.
So, the beginning of that paragraph, which the quote is a part of, he says the third figure of irony is romantic irony. And again, the question is who speaks. Remember, the question of this section is about who speaks. And so in the first one, it was the individual. But here we have the third figure of irony appears. Romantic irony determines the one who speaks as the person and no longer as the individual. It grounds itself in the finite synthetic unity. So the individual has this analytic kind of relationship, whereas this one is a finite synthetic unity of the person. And no longer the analytic identity, yeah, so that, sorry, just repeating what you said, and no longer on the analytic identity of the individual. So in this one, there's a coextensiveness of the I and representation.
Yeah, I think that goes back to, I think, earlier what you were saying when you were talking about the analytic, the subject versus the individual, the analytic versus, or the descriptive versus the definitional. And I think now we've moved beyond that, even maybe into a further ideal state where now we have the person and not just the individual, which is no longer just the subject, which is no longer just experiencing the natural state. So it's like we're now like meta layers above everything.
Then he says it's defined by, so he defines it, he gives a definition. It's defined by the coextensiveness of the I and representation. So the I would take it as the subject, and then the question is, what does this word representation mean? What does it mean? And the normal, sorry, I'll give an answer to that. What I think the normal way we understand representation is the relationship between the object and the idea. There is a kind of a Platonic aspect to that, the kind of traditional understanding of representation, I would say. So it's kind of interesting he uses that term. So something presents, again, represents the idea of something, but I would imagine he's not using it in that sense here.
So to me, when he says,
and he goes on to say
when
about
he said, real quick, he says the coextensiveness of the I in representation. To me, that's when we start talking about specifically Brooks and who Brooks is versus the individual that kind of I am versus the subject versus the immediate experiencer of things that is underlying all of that. Like the fact that there is a Brooks that sort of exists, the I coexists, is coextensive with representation, intertwined. And I love how he uses the synthetic unity of the person, no longer in the analytical identity of the individual. It's now this level where I'm almost putting on, as Kierkegaard says, the costumes in order to determine what I am at any given moment. And I'm very aware of such things. And the difference between Montaigne's essays already inscribed in the classical world insofar as they explore the most diverse figures of individuation, and Confessions, announcing romanticism insofar as they constitute the first manifestation of a person or an I, that ego that we run into a little bit later. This feels like it's sort of a starting version of formulating towards how we got to the place where maybe we have the I, the thing that I consider to be me, versus just being an individual versus just being a subject.
I think it's important to remember what the I is, because the I can be a number of different things. So if you remember the example I think he gave about from the story, basically, so Adam, the sinner, Adam in the garden. There's the I can be many different things. This is why it's synthetic. It's not individual is descriptive. The synthetic goes beyond. It can be many things. So it's the notion of synthesis means to bring different things together. So the I has a number of different identities. And the question then is, what about representation? But then he goes on to say there's much more to this than a mere shifting of terms. And then he says to determine its full import, it would necessarily should evaluate the difference between Montaigne's essays, which are examples, I would say, of the individual. And insofar as they explore the most diverse figures of individuation, and Rousseau's Confessions, in absence of romanticism, as far as they constitute the first manifestation of a person or an I. And then he talks about the idea. So that in a sense, that he's saying there is the two examples of how the difference between the individual and the subject are kind of manifested in literature, in writing. But then he talks about the idea, because I think this is where the relationship to representation starts to appear. He says not only the universal idea, the sensible particularly become now the character possibility of the person, but also the two extremes of individuality in the words corresponding to individuals. And I think it's this sense of possibility, which seems to be a really very important aspect of this. So, and it goes back, if you think of the I as being, it has a number of possibilities. And the example that Deleuze gave previously in a previous series, he said Adam, the sinner, Adam sits and, was made, a woman was made from his rib, from his side, and things like that. These different possibilities of the same term, the same subject. And I think this is where I think this notion of possibility, so he says, not only the universal idea and the sensible become now the characteristic possibilities of the person, but they also become the two extremes of individuality and the worlds corresponding to individuals. So he's bringing this kind of idea of individuality, of the individual into this. These possibilities continue to be distributed into originary and derived possibilities. So originally, the origin, what something comes from.
And it's I think that and the derived, that the play switches basically from classical, maybe, let me try to say this, see if you agree, JC, I'm looking at you too. The play switches basically from sort of classical irony, where due to whatever idealism you want to say, God or whatever, that the individual is derived from. With romantic irony, it's actually almost the reverse, that the individual is almost at the center and worlds are derived from them. Again, to say that romantic irony treats the person as this unlimited class with one member, the point of origin now becomes this person, which is now so deeply within this idealized state and in assent that you've kind of become you've become very deeply removed from it. Because he says, like classical irony, he says very cleanly that the individual and being, with a capital B, are coextensive with representation in that sort of classical sense. Whereas in romantic, it's individuality and and their worlds become possibilities because the I and representation are coextensive, which is a shift.
Yeah, and in the previous one, he said that it's the irony is the thing that enables the being an individual within the world of representation. But I think he's saying here, let me just see. So he's talking about possibilities, and he talks about two kinds of possibilities. So he says not only the universal idea and the sensible particularity. So the universal idea is the kind of Platonic idea. It's universal idea, and the sensible particularity, in which the sensible particularity, the thing in which it's embodied in the senses. He said, become now the characteristic possibility of the person. So he's relating that to the person, but also, and carries on, but also the two extremes of individuality in the worlds corresponding to individuals. So I think he's bringing these two, the individual is now becoming part of this. So he says it has this notion, there's two extremes of individuality, and therefore of the ideas of worlds corresponding to the individuals. And he says what they are. These possibilities continue to be distributed into originary and derived possibilities. So there's two types of possibility, originary and derived. He says originary designates those predicates of the person which are constant in all possible words, and these are the categories. Again, these are the Kantian terms. Whereas derived designates only individual variables according to which the person is embodied in different words, in different worlds. So the originary possibilities are the predicate are constant. So substance, for example, I think is a category, but I'm not sure, and number, things like that. So they're constantly, you can apply across all possible worlds, whereas derived designates the individual variables and quantum of which person embodied in different worlds. So they only apply to that person in that single world. And from this, a profound transformation comes about, the universal of the idea. So he's saying now there's a profound transformation of this universality of the idea. So the Platonic notion of the idea is that it's universal. It can be applied across all different scenarios of the form. So there is a profound transformation of the universality of the idea, of the form of subjectivity, and of the model of language as function of the possible. So he's saying this. So he said there is now a profound change. But can we say what that change is? So the position. I'm not clear on this personally, but if we read it, perhaps somebody will understand it better. The position of the person is an unlimited class, which nevertheless has only one member. Such is the romantic irony, and that's something we had, I think, last week. So that the person is an unlimited class, but with only one member. And this notion of class is to do with species and genus, species, are kind of dividing something up. So, which is only one. Normally, you'd expect more than one member in a class. Such is romantic irony. So that it's perhaps here that we're talking about the absolute individuality of the subject within romanticism. Perhaps, I don't know. I'm just guessing. And then he goes on, there are precursive elements in the Cartesian cogito, and above all in the Leibnizian person. But these elements remain subordinate to the demands of individuation, whereas in romanticism, which follows Kant, they liberate and express themselves through, say, overthrowing the subordination. So, and then I think that then the quote that follows becomes slightly clearer. Slightly clearer. So he calls it, the quote, this is called a poetic freedom. So that if we take Kierkegaard's language, this this freeing of the subject is a poetic freedom, which includes become nothing at all is included. So one can become nothing. So one is free. Whereas perhaps the notion of the individual implies that one is not free. It's descriptive.
So the Kierkegaard quote, and thanks by the way for keeping that going while I ran 3-year-old. The Kierkegaard quote, I think it's worth sort of breaking down a little bit because I'd love to understand how you're taking it in, Derek. To me, it is this sort of a deeply cynical critique about basically as a person may choose to be as they are, or how the person is developed, and the costumes that they put on, the movement through all of these different personages that they may play, but that none of them are actually adequate, because instead they now exist in this place of they have this eternal ego, this thing that that Deleuze keeps going back to, that is deeply universalized, now exists within Aeon, and there is no way to actually have that be a thing that is represented in a way that is satisfying in any sense whatsoever. So this eternal ego can't ever become satisfied or adequated by having whatever costume or whatever personages or representation you may place around it. And that, to me, that's a really interesting sort of take by Kierkegaard, or at least how I read this.
Yeah, I'm not personally not that clear on it, but but I think it's significant that the idea for me, what I got out of that previous section was the notion of the subject now becomes kind of almost endlessly free. There's a kind of freedom, a kind of release in a certain way. So he said, for example, an unlimited class with only one member. This is romantic irony. So it's unlimited in the class it occupies. And then the beginning of the Kierkegaard, I don't think it's by chance, this infinite poetic freedom. So I think one could say that this is what the romantic irony is to do with this infinite poetic freedom. Already sketched by the fact that to become nothing at all is itself included. So it's about, again, perhaps this notion of becoming what. So this. So, and then you get for the ironic individuals, most often it traversed a multitude of determinations in the form of possibility. So you can be this, you can be that, you can be this, you can be that, and poetically live through them. So this is the poetic freedom, I would suggest, before he ends in nothingness, because he says it's almost like it will inevitably end in nothingness. For irony, the soul is constantly on a pilgrimage. So the ironist can have these different determinations that ironists can take on: child, rich man, poor man, beggar man. They have he said they have the validity of possibility. So they're something that they can be this. They can be the rich man, the poor man, the beggar man, and then he can even adopt them all. But then what costs the ironist time is the lavish the proper costume for the poetic personage. So the appearance, how one appears, one adopts this figure, but then one needs to adopt to select the costume proper to that. So perhaps appears to others.
Yeah, so if I decide that I'm a beggar man, I have to have the significations that surround being a beggar man. I can't just say, yes, I'm a beggar man, and be wearing a $5,000 tuxedo, stepping out of a limo. I mean, like there's assumed significations that go with these things, as he calls it here, this costume that you might put on as you poeticize. To me, this is not an infinite poetic freedom. The infinite poetic freedom is purely in the space of this idealized romantic irony, and the take he's making here, or the take I think Deleuze is taking here, or maybe I'm just taking, is that ultimately, no matter what happens now at this point, there is no way to adequately actually describe the person, that at no point will we ever get to this, a way that any of these things actually describe the ego. We're now well beyond that. We're so disconnected from being, because again, signification can't actually deal with the way things actually are at the surface. And as we go to the depths, either the other way, I want to move to the next paragraph, because I think it's all of this is ultimately leading to, however we may interpret it, it's leading to an absolute critique of the idea of irony and how it operates. Because ultimately, all of these forms of irony, no matter what they are, confine the singularity within the limits of the individual or the person. It places the singularity within that person. And again, the singularity being pretty important when it comes to how meaning or sense is derived as sort of these base elements that sort of form that network of meaning that the series are derived from, and ultimately sense is generated. And it's, as to quote, thus irony only in appearance assumes the role of a vagabond. But this is why all these figures are threatened by an intimate enemy who works on them from within, the undifferentiated ground, the groundless abyss of which we previously spoke, that represents tragic thought and tragic tone, with which irony maintains the most ambivalent relations. It is Dionysus, present beneath Socrates, but it is also the demon who holds up to God and his creatures the mirror wherein universal individuality dissolves. It is the chaos which brings about the undoing of the person. And he starts going in and sort of breaking apart how these elements exist, yes, on the ascent, but they are predicated again on the abyss, but they work very much against each other. And he goes into here, the line I want to go with is we have seen that this language of the ground, the language which is confused with the depth of the body, had a twofold power, that of shattered phonetic elements and that of non-articulated tonic values, the real way words are spoken, the sort of nature of that. And the disconnection of them, he is basically saying this is where irony sort of begins to fail. And his critique is that all of these things sort of start to fall apart when you sort of preface them against each other. That's how I read that. Before we get into the first and his second sort of examples of such ideal.
Yeah, I think what he's saying here is that the figures of irony, so you've got the classic and you've got the romantic figures of irony, is what do they do? What they have in common is that they confine the singularity. So the kind of unpredictability, the aleatory point, let's call it, within the limits of the individual or the person. So they're confined. So romantic. So in the classic, we have this notion of irony enabling a relationship between the individual and just trying to look back previously. So the individual and the universality of the idea. And here within the romantic, you have it's confined within the infinite poetic freedom, the so-called infinite poetic freedom, which is characteristic of the romantic period, romantic movement. And he said this is what they both have in common. And he says this irony only in appearance assumes the role of a vagabond. I.e., it's in this. I don't know if it'd be interesting to see how he goes on from this, but irony here only assumes the appearance of a vagabond. Therefore, in other words, doesn't have this freedom. I think this is what he's looking for. He says this is why these figures, i.e. the classical and the romantic, are threatened by an intimate enemy who works on them from within, the undifferentiated ground, the groundless abyss of which we previously spoke. That represents tragic thought and tragic tone, with which irony maintains the most ambivalent relations. And this is why it says Dionysus beneath Socrates. So this is the embodiment almost of the tragic or the unrestrained in Dionysus beneath Socrates. The Socratic is the use of classic irony, whereas beneath that there is this Dionysian element that is threatening it. undermining it, I would say.
And he goes right into it immediately and says, the sort of ways that this happen, it's the two sides is either with shadowed phonetic elements and that of the non-articulated tonic values. The first, the shadowed phonetic elements, threatens and overturns classical discourse from within. The second one, which is the non-articulated tonic values, threatens and overturns romantic discourse. In each case, for each type of discourse, 3 languages must be distinguished. And he goes through, essentially, manifestation, signification, and denotation. And it's a bam, bam, bam. He burns through those. And he ends with esoteric language, which in each case represents a subversion from the ground up of the ideal language and the disillusion of the ones who owns the real language. That play, again, talking about sort of, again, the generation of irony and how the elements underneath the real bodies are almost working against it pretty much constantly, threatening it, I suppose, as he says.
This corresponds to the previous notion of the good sense and common sense, which for him represents the dogmatic images of thought that kind of like confines and singularities, or suppresses the Dionysian passions and so forth that are the groundless, sense of being.
I'd say yes. So I don't want to say too much of a yes. A lot of what he's talking through here is less good sense, common sense directly, and more breaking down why. I suppose he's chasing that thing of why these things break down, specifically utilizing irony versus humor as the method to do that with, and to look at how irony operates, which it operates from the individual as being the fount and also the end, and the individual and then also the personage, which again plays more and more into the heights. And as this happens and as irony plays this, and we start seeing how it works and where it's calling from things, and then again where things are working against it, that ultimately with the esoteric language, again going back over the last 18 series, the line here that I think is important is, in each case, moreover, there are internal relations between the ideal model and its esoteric reversal, as between irony and the tragic ground, to the point that it is impossible to know on which side maximum irony lies. It is for this reason that it is vain to seek a unique formula, a unique concept, which would be applicable to every esoteric language, for the grand literal, syllabic, and phonetic synthesis of Courtejablin, for example. I'm going to anglicize all of this, sorry. With the classical world comes to a close, as well as the evolutive tonic synthesis of Jean-Pierre Brisset, with which Romanticism came to an end. These elements that sort of began to destroy them and how they worked, because they, again, come from within these elements, and how, again, the stuff he's been talking about, this esoteric language, the way that these things are constructed, utilizing the depths and the heights sort of in and of themselves while they're actually sort of combating elements, is, I think, a lot of his critique here. Am I far off there, Derek?
Yeah, no, it sounds right, actually.
It's a really interesting...
I think
Sorry,
he's not... I was just going to say, I don't think he's, in a sense, dismissing these three different ideas of who is speaking within this use of irony. That he's establishing kind of a really interesting relationship between the three, I would say. But then, yeah.
Well, and that goes to...
It's... Well, he said this thing about not establishing a formula. So it's vain to seek a unique formula, a unique concept, which would be applicable to every esoteric language. So we have the notion of an ideal language, the classical discourse, and the esoteric language.
And that kind of leads into the final paragraph, and I'll just read a part of it. To the question, who is speaking, we answer sometimes with the individual, sometimes with the person, and sometimes with the ground which dissolves both. Quote, the self of the lyric poet raises its voice from the bottom of the abyss of being. Its subjectivity is pure imagination. End quote. But a final response yet remains, one which challenges the undifferentiated primitive ground in the forms of the individual and the person, and which rejects their contradiction as well as their complementarity. And then he moves in. We'll get to that because this last paragraph's a fucking lot that happens. I have to say I agree, Derek. I don't think he's dismissing. He's saying like this is actually how we answer to the question who is speaking. Sometimes we say the individual, sometimes with the person, and sometimes with the ground which dissolves both. So sometimes it's, hey, who's speaking? Oh, he is. They are, and I point. That's an individual. Sometimes with the person who's speaking. Oh, Brooks, who runs the DGQC, and he speaks with his sultry, dulcet tones all the time. And sometimes with the ground, which dissolves both, which is that sort of esoteric, weird, disconnected language of it. How to say, featherless biped, maybe. The ground which dissolves both. It eliminates the individual and the person. These are the three ways we answer that. And then we have one more final response that challenges these elements and rejects their complementarity and their contradictions. To continue, no singularities are not imprisoned within individuals and persons, and one does not fall into an undifferentiated ground, into groundless depth, when one undoes the individual and the person. The impersonal and the pre-individual are the free nomadic singularities. Deeper than any other ground is the surface and the skin. A new type of esoteric language is formed here, which is its own model in reality. Becoming mad changes shape in its climb to the surface along the straight line of the aeon. In eternity, the same thing happens to the dissolved self, the cracked I, the lost identity, when they cease being buried and begin, on the contrary, to liberate the singularities of the surface. It's his answer, instead of saying we have these three, individual, person, or the ground, there's a fourth. What if the answer is the pre-individual, the impersonal? It's not an I or a we even. It's this pre-individual conception. To say, fast forward a little bit to another book, it's Desiring Machines, the multiplicity is the one saying. Who says? The multiplicity says. Is sort of another way to sort of think through that. And I adore this final paragraph because of this language. That's how I read that part. Before we move on to the last bit where they talk about nonsense and sense. Thoughts on this? Am I far off? JC, Derek, anyone?
I think the impersonal pre-individual is the transcendental. That's how he described it in a previous series. So he says the impersonal and pre-individual are the pre-nomadic singularities. And he says, so just going back, final remains one which challenges the undifferentiated primitive ground in the forms of the individual and the person, which rejects their contradiction as well as their complementarity, that neither do they contradict each other, nor do they strengthen each other. No, singularities are not imprisoned with individuals and persons, and one does not fall into undifferentiated groundless depth, and one does the individual and the person.
Oh, yes.
No, I think you're right. It's the
Personal and the
transcendental
pre-individual.
field. I think you're right.
Yeah, and are the free nomadic singularities.
Right. So those are part of the ritual, right? That where you talked about singularities before, and the they're nomadic and in Nietzschean terms, it would be the Dionysian and event, sense, and ion, right? They're just trying to bring some of the different.
Yeah, no. I think, I mean, to the question who is speaking, I think Deleuze might also say, if someone asks that, we give them a blow with a staff. Like that to call back to an earlier paragraph. Like it's the transcendental field that we go back to that. We don't have to ask who is. The moment we've done that, we've moved outside of sort of chronos and into aeon and into representation just by sort of asking the question. And that, fuck it. It gets into the second half of the paragraph. Nonsense and sense have done away with their relation of dynamic opposition in order to enter the co-presence of a static genesis as the nonsense of the surface and the sense which hovers over it. The tragic and ironic give way to a new value, that of humor, or if irony is the coextensiveness of being with the individual, or of the I with representation, humor is the coextensiveness of sense with nonsense. Humor is the art of the surfaces and of the doubles, of nomad singularities and of the always displaced aleatory point. It is the art of the static genesis, the savoir-faire of the pure event, and the fourth person singular, with every signification, denotation, manifestation suspended, all height and depth abolished. That's why I think the idea of the I give you a blow with my staff if you ask who said such a thing. Who is speaking? It's I think a play towards that, because it's very much coming back to, as Derek was saying, that the transcendental field, the fourth person singular, which is a great phrase and should be a punk band name.
I mean, I think here, for me, is returning to the world of Lewis Carroll, I think here. And he says, so the impersonal pre-individual are the free nomadic singularities, deep and any ground as the surface and the skin. A new type of esoteric language is formed here, which is its own model and reality. So it doesn't rely on anything outside of itself. It is its own model and reality. So again, if we go back to the kind of quotes from like the Zen koan, we can, if we apply those criteria, we kind of begin to see how they function.
So the static genesis is that which out of which actuality begins out of the virtual. Okay. So I get the sense that the virtual, the singularities from the virtual are always with us, but the individual and the personality persons can find the singularities within those maybe actualities of
because he says that nonsense. I think there is this sense in which they're not being opposed to each other. So he says nonsense and sense have done away with their relations of dynamic opposition in order to enter into the co-presence of a static genesis. So they're both there at the same time. So again, if you look back to the koan, you'll see both sense and nonsense within that one thing, but they're not in opposition relationship. As the nonsense of the surface and sense which hovers over it, the nonsense of the surface and the sense of the surface. And the sense of hovers over the surface of sense, where the sense and nonsense comes together. There is sense there, but I think what's difficult is to extract that sense.
Right.
The tragic and the ironic give way to a new value, that of humor.
So sense is embodied in the actualities of the individual, the person, right? And so when we can respond, out of sense or out of the nonsense of these persons and individuals, right?
That they're not in opposition. They enter into the co-presence. They're together. They're present together in the static genesis. You remember what the idea of static genesis is, that sense is created, and yet sense is static. It's not dynamic in itself. And the previous series, he's talked about the static ontological genesis and the static logical genesis.
Yes.
So this notion of static genesis is characteristic, I would say, of this notion of sense.
Let's say the work of sense, effectively, I think, is where the transcendental field is essentially the work of sense. The generation of individuals for the static ontological genesis, followed by sort of the way language sort of works in the static logical genesis, and the generation of that which also produces sense. And that's, again, this really fascinating process that's sort of in the process of sense being made, sense also works, and vice versa. When sense works, it is also being made. That the sort of elements of the two sides. It was fascinating. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just diving. This is really great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, because then he goes on, he says the tragic and ironic way to new value, that of humour. So we've had the tragic previously. So the Stoic, the tragedies of Seneca, he gave that example, and Elizabethan theatre. But he gives way to this new value, that humour. He said if irony is a coextensive being with the individual, or of the I with represent. So these are the two things we've talked about previously. So the being with individual is the classic irony, and the I with representation, I would perhaps is the romantic irony. Humour is the coextensive sense with nonsense. So they're together at the same time. So this is humour. Is sense. There is a sense, and there's also nonsense at the same moment. And humour is the art of the surfaces and of the doubles of nomad singularities, and they always display salutary point. It is the art of the static genesis. So it's interesting. It says the art. So it's something created. I would say it's kind of actively created. The savoir-faire of the pure event of the first person singular. So there's kind of a notion that it doesn't just come into being. It has to be created in some way.
Well, and humor, again, humor plays in a different place. Irony sits in a place very much that is about the irony thinks about thought, subjectivity, synthesis above all of us, and plays with the way words go against other words, and it's sort of thoughtful and clever. I used there's an example in Fight Club. I brought up with JC. I still think it applies very nicely. It's a scene where he meets Tyler Durden in the plane, and he says to Tyler, you're the most interesting single-serving friend I've ever had. And there's a beat as no one responds. And Edward Norton's character goes, oh, because you see everything on a plane is single-serving. And Tyler goes, oh, no, I get it. It's clever. How's that working out for you, being clever? It's this great switch where the irony is being used by Edward Norton's character there to sort of have that sort of cerebral, aha, I've thought through this. I'm using the thing other than its literal intention, haha. And whereas Tyler's actually being humorous, he's doing the act of almost pulling down as Edward Norton's character is pulling up. And it's that movement of humor, that the pulling back down to the surface, that is what humor does, that Deleuze is really aiming at here. And I really love that sort of juxtaposition and switch between them. Because irony sits above events and flows and plays sort of in a place that requires knowing what things are, knowing what the intention is of who speaks, what the definition of words are, what is the ideal form of any given thing. That's what irony requires. And humor doesn't. Humor is a clown, a well-done clown, or I shouldn't say clown, because clowns can be creepy as shit. But it's good. It's good. Sort of physical play can be that. It's playing with the space of sense and nonsense, where it's not necessarily even a human, but instead a collection of things that we're looking at, and we're not playing with ideas. It's much more immanent in its experience.
Yeah, and in the kind of expression of propositions, he's right at the end. He says, "With every signification, denotation, manifestation suspended." So there's no sense of literary of concepts. There's no sense of denoting what something is, and there's no sense of the individual, the individual expressing themselves. All these are suspended, and consequently, all height and depth are abolished. So which suggests if signification, denotation, manifestation is suspended, the only thing that's left is sense. And the sense and its coextensive other, or double, or whatever you want to call it, is nonsense.
Kind of reminds me of the ending in series 18 where, right, you had the three images of the philosopher of ascent and descent and emphasized that it was the philosopher of the surface that actually arrived at sense. But again, here, that's the coextensiveness of sense with nonsense, because you can have sense without having also the nonsense. So even though the height and depth may be abolished, they're not abolished and therefore non-existent, just coextensive, but not getting you to the humor, I guess, of it all.
Would a real question, because we didn't get a chance to really dive into humor versus irony, and I spent all night reading about it. But a good form, one of my favorite forms of humor, which is satire, feels like it would be within Deleuze's, because it's very much about, there is a level of irony because it does play with ideas, but it is about ultimately dragging us back down towards the reality of a situation, towards us just being people. The height of things being pulled back down, it feels like that kind of movement fits within that, the humor and satire sort of fitting together, which I like as well. It's interesting when you start talking about how these things play, and irony being that of, misusing language intentionally and pushing people up towards that, and you start actually thinking about the topology of how these things operate. You can actually start picking apart different types of silliness or humor or irony or whatever people use that makes people laugh, and finding kind of where it sits in those. It's fascinating. Yeah, there's a lot. There's just so much there. Jesus. Before we close out, because it has been 2 hours, does anyone have questions? Because I know I've been rambling quite a bit, and it's been the Brooks and Derek show, which is fine. But I figure if anyone else has a question or some statement or thing, you're more than welcome to jump in now. Love to hear from you. I'm going to assume that's a no. How about you, Derek? Any more thoughts? Let's go at it. Let's do it.
No, just interested by your example of satire, because I kind of feel satire is perhaps a mixture of humor and irony. Because if we take Deleuze's definition of humor, which is characterized by the suspension of signification, denotation, manifestation, I would imagine that in satire works on a certain sense of recognition, i.e. a certain idea of denotation.
I'd agree with that. I think there's a level of that. It for sure operates. The reason I sort of put it in that spot is twofold. One is when we talk about the literal focus of it, like where it's aimed, irony is always focused on the subject or the individual. Satire is focused on like the human animal behind it. And the second reason is because of the movement sort of during. And this may sound weird and maybe I'm not making sense, but as you're experiencing irony, there is a moment as you go where you're looking at what is the thing. I'm looking at the things, and then it becomes more cerebral, and an ascent for sure happens during the course of a proper ironic joke or ironic story that becomes more cerebral and more specifically based in representation. Whereas satire, it does utilize a lot of those same things, but very much the play is not upwards, it is downwards. It is straight at this, like the underlying things of what things are, or the mocking of the representation almost entirely. It feels, and again, it may just be an intuitive play. It feels like it has some of the parts of irony for sure, but it definitely has a different use. Definitely.
I think from what Deleuze is saying, I think the idea of humor is that it's essentially unrestrained. So he says that humour is the art of the surface and doubles of nomad singularities, and they always displace aleatory points. So it's kind of unconstrained, it's unrestrained, and it's the art of the static yet from which this meaning, sense appears. Whereas he previously said the figures of irony have in common that they confine the singularities within the limits of the individual or the person. So with irony, there's a sense of constraint, and I think within humour, there's a sense of unrestraint.
I can get with that. I would maybe phrase it slightly differently for me, where it's in irony, it's the joke or the laughing moment, I suppose. Let's call it the laughing moment, the amusement moment, is wrapped up, and so it's constrained in the sense that I have to figure out what is being said at any given point, right? I have to go through that process, and there is a dawning of me going through it. Whereas with humor, there's an almost imminence to it. It is unrestrained. There's when my son was very young, and it happens quite often still, and you can experience it with other people who are older too. But there's a difference between kind of the laughter of someone who is responding to a cerebral joke or someone who is just losing their shit laughing over something they can't help. And the feeling of that laughter and how that laughter works is drastically different. And so I think, to me, again, from an intuitive perspective and my own experience, I kind of displace them that way as well, that there is an unrestrained, uncontrollable, imminent experience of laughing that I can't help versus the oh, I get it kind of thing that happens with a secondary sort of ironic joke that's a little bit more cerebral.
Yeah, I think irony is it doesn't need to be funny as well, does it? It's not necessarily humorous, I think, irony. And
that's fair. It's fair. That's why I said amusing,
I
think.
Yeah. But there's a kind of misdirection, I would say, irony. Irony misdirects. Whereas humour is this unrestricted. I think this notion, nomadic singularity, always there's a notion of unrestrainedness. But there's a notion of sense coming out of that, static genesis. And it does give us the pure event role, but which I don't think the irony would do. I think this is why it's a series of humour, but despite which he spends most of his time talking about irony. I think he's working towards humour. It just appears at the end right at the end of the series.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that. I don't know. We could easily sit and debate humor and irony and go through all of it. It actually would be, I think, pretty fun. But you're spot on. It's irony is misdirection. It originally started with lying, like flat out lying, but in a way that the audience knew that the person in the play was lying. Like that's lying with the knowledge that the person taking it in is aware of such a thing. Otherwise, it's just lying. That's kind of iron. That's kind of where irony comes from. So it doesn't even have to necessarily be even amusing. It feels like it maybe there's a whole thing to discuss there. I love the idea of irony is fascinating, but humor too, and Deleuze's sort of take on that and playing towards the Zen koans as he has here. So great. All right. With that, I am going to go ahead and close out. It's been 2 hours. Thank all of you for joining us. We will next week be moving into 20, series 20, which is the problem of morality in Stoic philosophy, the moral problem of Stoic philosophy, which will be less funny. Just letting you know, a lot less funny, but we'll get there maybe at some point. So thank all of you very much.